Miss Marple, the Dressmaker's Pin Discrepancy. Good morning, friends, and welcome back to the hearth. I'm Edward, and today we are unravelling the story of a woman who measured the village for 30 years, who knew where every pin belonged, and whose death hinged on the fact that one pin was in exactly the wrong place. Before we begin, I would love to know, do you have a craft or a trade, something you do with your hands with such consistency that anyone who knows you would notice immediately if something were done differently? Tell us in the comments. That question, as it happens, is at the very centre of this mystery. Chapter 1. The woman who knew where every pin belonged. She had been the dressmaker of St. Mary Mead since the year after the war, which put her tenure in the village at something approaching 30 years. She worked from the front room of her cottage on Vicarage Lane, a room that smelled of warm cloth and lavender water and the faint industrial tang of good shears. Her workbench sat below the south-facing window for the light. Her thread collection occupied an entire wall. She had made wedding dresses, christening gowns, funeral clothes, and everything of consequence in between, and she'd done all of it with the composed, unhurried competence of a woman who understood that the body is a private thing, and that the trust placed in a dressmaker is not unlike the trust placed in a doctor, and she honoured it accordingly. She also, over 30 years, heard a very great deal. Women talk during fittings. They talk because they are standing still and because there is someone attending to them who is focused on the cloth and not on their faces. And this creates a peculiar intimacy, the intimacy of the confessional, where one speaks partly because the listener is near and partly because they seem, in that moment, safely elsewhere. Edith Polworthy had absorbed 30 years of that particular variety of confidence. She never repeated it. She never referenced it. She simply filed it away in the careful archive of a mind that had learned very early that information held quietly is considerably more useful than information shared quickly. But something had changed. 3 weeks before her death, her apprentice, a girl of 19 named Clara, would tell Miss Marple later that Edith had seemed, in those final weeks, to be coming to a decision about something. Not agitated, nothing so dramatic as that. Simply purposeful in a new way, as though she had located the end of a thread she had been carrying for a long time and had finally resolved to pull it. Clara had not asked what the decision was. One did not ask Edith Polworthy questions she had not invited. On the Tuesday evening before she was found, Edith had sent Clara home at 5 o'clock, which was earlier than usual for a Tuesday, and had told her she had letters to write. Clara had noted this because letters were not Edith's habit. She was not a correspondent. She was a woman of presence rather than paper, of the words said in the room rather than committed to an envelope, but she had letters to write. And the following morning Clara arrived at 8:30 to find the cottage unlocked, which was wrong, and the workroom lit, which was also wrong. Because Edith did not light the workroom until the light failed in the afternoon, and she found Edith at her bench, leaning forward with her chin on her chest and a dressmaker's pin upright in the side of her neck, and she ran for Dr. Haydock and did not stop running. The coroner, having examined the body in the workroom, concluded that Edith had fallen asleep at her bench, which was not unusual in elderly women who worked long hours, and that the pin had been lodged in the fabric she was working on, and had been introduced into her neck as she slumped forward, catching the carotid artery in a manner that, while statistically improbable, was not anatomically impossible. The inquest took 40 minutes, and Miss Marple attended it, sitting in the third row and knitted a grey sleeve and said nothing, which was the thing she did when she was thinking most carefully, and she had been thinking very carefully indeed since the previous afternoon, when Clara had appeared at her garden gate still in her outdoor coat, still trembling slightly at the wrists, and had said, in the particular way of someone reporting a fact that they know to be important without yet understanding why, that the pin in Miss Polworthy's neck was standing upright. Miss Marple had set down her secateurs and looked at Clara and said very gently, "Are you quite certain it was standing upright, Clara? Not lying flat?" And Clara had said yes, quite certain. She had been looking at it while she waited for Dr. Haydock. She had been trying not to look at Miss Polworthy's face, and the pin had been the thing her eyes kept returning to. Standing straight up like a flag in a sandcastle, and she had been thinking even then, even before she understood why she was thinking it, that Miss Polworthy would never have left a pin standing like that. Miss Marple had thanked her. She'd given her a cup of tea and a slice of seed cake and had walked her to the gate. She'd gone back inside. She'd sat down and picked up her knitting and begun, with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has done this before, and does not enjoy it but will not flinch from it, to understand what the upright pin meant. Edith Polworthy laid her pins flat. Every seamstress who knew her would have said the same. She had developed the habit early in her career, after reading of a child who had swallowed an upright pin left in a garment, and she had never varied from it in 40 years of practice. Clara knew it. The ladies of the WI who had brought their alterations to Vicarage Lane for 3 decades knew it. It was, as Miss Marple would later say to Dr. Haydock, with the pleasant precision of someone stating something they have thought through completely, as much a signature of Edith Polworthy as her handwriting. A standing pin in Edith's fabric was not the work of Edith's hands, but the coroner had not known Edith Polworthy. The coroner came from Radchester, and the coroner had closed the inquest and the village had accepted it, because the village found accidental death considerably more comfortable than the alternative, and because comfort, in Miss Marple's experience, was one of the most dangerous forces in a small community. She turned her knitting. She thought about who had been in that workroom on Tuesday evening. After Clara went home at 5 o'clock, she thought about letters, and she thought about the thing that Clara had mentioned almost as an afterthought on her way out through the garden gate, the thing that had made Miss Marple's hands still for just a moment on her secateurs before she resumed her pruning with her usual composure. There had been an envelope on Edith's writing desk, Clara said, half addressed, a name written on it in Edith's neat hand, but no address below, as though she had been interrupted before she could finish. The letter to write, the decision she had been coming to, whatever Edith Polworthy had known, and whoever she had been about to tell, had gotten her killed on a Tuesday evening in February, and a coroner from Radchester who did not know how she placed her pins had sent her to her grave without justice. And Miss Marple, who had sat in the 3rd row with her knitting and said nothing, intended to correct that. But first she needed to see that envelope, and she needed to do it before whoever had been in that workroom on Tuesday evening thought to go back for it. Chapter 2. The envelope on the writing desk. Before we go any further, friends, I want to ask you something. Have you ever arrived somewhere just a little too late, by minutes rather than hours, and felt the specific unease of knowing that something has already been touched, already altered before you got there? Tell us in the comments, because that is precisely what greeted Miss Marple on Vicarage Lane on Thursday morning. The cottage of Edith Polworthy stood between the post office lane and the wall of the churchyard, which meant that it occupied a position of some irony in the village geography, caught between the place where news travelled and the place where news ended. It was a low building of old stone with a deep-set front window and a garden that had been kept with the same methodical precision Edith brought to everything she did. The roses cut back hard for winter, the paths edged, a single bare honeysuckle trained along the front wall with the patience of someone who understands that certain beautiful things require years before they declare themselves. The cottage was locked when Miss Marple arrived at 9:30. This was expected. What was not expected was the unlocked side gate, which gave on to the small passage between the cottage wall and the churchyard boundary, and the fact that the side passage showed, in the thin February mud along its edge, the recent impression of a man's boot pointing toward the back of the cottage and not, as far as she could determine from where she stood, pointing back again. Someone had gone in. Someone had not come out by the same route. She stood at the gate for a moment with her knitting bag over her arm and the expression she wore when she was deciding something, which looked to the casual observer like the expression of a woman who has forgotten what she came for and is trying gently to remember. Then she walked around to the front of the cottage and knocked, because the obvious thing was always worth trying first. The door was answered by Philip Polworthy, Edith's nephew, a man of 43 with the particular look of someone who has recently slept in their clothes and would prefer you not to notice. He had arrived, he said, on Wednesday evening when the news reached him in Exeter, and he had been given a key by the solicitor, as Edith's only surviving relation, worried to collect certain personal effects. He looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a man who is not sure whether to be relieved or inconvenienced by her presence, and settled on a kind of guarded cordiality that satisfied neither. "I was a friend of your aunt's," said Miss Marple, which was true in the way that most things Miss Marple said were true, accurate in its facts, and somewhat selective in its implications. "I've brought some seed cake for you. I always think one forgets to eat at these times, and it doesn't do." Philip Polworthy, who had indeed forgotten to eat, stood aside to let her in. The front room, the workroom, had been closed off, which Miss Marple noted, and the sitting room beyond it was the room into which she was shown, a small comfortable space that smelled of the same lavender as the workroom but more strongly. As though the lavender had been applied here deliberately, rather than simply absorbed over years from the cloth. She accepted tea. She admired a watercolour above the mantelpiece. She asked Philip gentle questions about his journey from Exeter and received polite, abbreviated answers from a man whose attention was clearly divided between courtesy and whatever else was occupying him. She was, as she sat there with her teacup, conducting a quiet inventory of what she could see from her chair. The writing desk stood in the corner of the sitting room, beside the window that overlooked the churchyard wall. It was a small bureau of dark wood, the sort that folds out to a writing surface, and it was closed, folded shut and closed. When Clara had seen the envelope, the bureau had been open. "Your aunt was a wonderful woman," said Miss Marple. "Very private in the best sense. She kept a great deal to herself. I imagine you must be discovering all sorts of things about her life here that you weren't aware of." Philip Polworthy looked at her. "Not especially," he said. "She was a dressmaker. She made things and mended them. It was a quiet life." "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Yes, I suppose it was." She looked at the closed bureau. He followed her glance just briefly, before looking away. She finished her tea. She declined a second cup on the grounds that she had rather a lot to do this morning, left the seed cake on the kitchen table, and took her leave with the warm, slightly distracted manner of a woman who has paid a kindly call and is now thinking about her next errand. On the front step she paused. "I don't suppose," she said, turning back with the air of someone to whom something has only just occurred, "that your aunt left any letters she had written but not yet posted. Only I know she'd been meaning to write to an old acquaintance of mine, a Mrs. Ferrars in Torquay, and I wondered whether it had been finished. I'd hate for Mrs. Ferrars to be waiting." Philip Polworthy's face did something careful and controlled. "I haven't found any unsent letters," he said. "I'll let you know if I do." "How very kind," said Miss Marple, "and do give my regards to the solicitor. Mr. Jameson, isn't it? A very capable man." She walked away down Vicarage Lane at her usual pace, which was to say unhurried, and she did not look back. But she thought about the expression on Philip Polworthy's face when she had named Mrs. Ferrars in Torquay. A name she had invented on the doorstep, a name attached to no real person, a name she had offered as a hook to see what it caught. What it had caught was the specific stillness of a man who recognised something he had not expected to be recognised. But here was the thing. The stillness had not been the stillness of guilt. It had been the stillness of confusion, of a man who has heard a name that means something to him, but cannot immediately account for why it means something. Which meant one of two things. Either Philip Polworthy had found the envelope and read the partial address, the name of the intended recipient, and was now trying to understand what his aunt had been doing and why. Or someone else had already removed the envelope before he arrived, and he had found nothing. And the name on the envelope was a name he recognised from some other context entirely. Miss Marple walked home. She thought about a boot print pointing toward a cottage and not pointing back out again. She thought about a bureau that Clara had seen open on Wednesday morning and Philip Polworthy had found closed on Wednesday evening. And she thought about the space between 5 o'clock on Tuesday, when Clara went home, and 8:30 on Wednesday, when Clara returned, and all the hours that space contained, and who had been moving through them and why. She let herself in through her garden gate. The February morning was brightening slightly, the winter sun finding a gap in the cloud and doing what it could with it, which was not very much but was something. She went inside and put the kettle on and picked up her knitting, which was a long narrow scarf in dark blue wool for her nephew Raymond, who never wore scarves but who she made them for regardless, on the basis that one day he might. And she thought about the Reverend Gerald Clement, Vicar of St. Bartholomew's, whose church wall ran along the side of Edith Polworthy's cottage garden, and who therefore had access to Vicarage Lane at any hour without anyone finding it unusual to see him there, and who had been, for 30 years, among the most regular of Edith's customers, having his vestments let out and taken in and mended with the annual reliability of a man whose weight fluctuated modestly with the liturgical calendar, more at Christmas and Easter, less through Lent, which Edith had once remarked upon to Clara with the dry observation that the Reverend took his own sermons to heart at least seasonally. The Reverend Clement, who had access to the lane, who had motive to know what Edith knew, who had at the harvest supper 3 months ago stood beside Miss Marple for 20 minutes, discussing, among other things, the question of old obligations and whether the passage of time diminished them. She had thought at the time that he was speaking theologically. She was no longer entirely certain of that. The kettle boiled. She made her tea. She sat down by the window that looked onto her winter garden, where nothing was flowering and everything was quietly, stubbornly alive beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to declare itself. That, she thought, had rather a lot in common with this particular case. The right moment was coming. She could feel it the way she could feel a change in the weather, not dramatically, not with any certainty she could have put into words, but with the particular bodily knowledge of someone who has spent a long life paying close attention to the small signs that precede large events. But she was not yet ready. She needed one more thing before she moved. She needed to know whose name had been on that envelope. And there was, she thought, finishing her first cup of tea and beginning immediately on a second, exactly one person in St. Mary Mead who might be able to tell her. Chapter 3. What Clara Remembered. Friends, we are now at the point in a mystery where the first layer of the ordinary has been lifted, and what lies beneath is not yet fully visible, but is beginning, if you look carefully, to have a shape. Before we go in, I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever told you a detail about a person, a habit, or a preference so specific and so consistent that the moment it was violated you would have known something was wrong without being able to say immediately what? Leave your answer in the comments. Miss Marple has built the entire architecture of her suspicion on exactly that kind of knowledge. Clara Burse lived with her mother in a narrow terraced house on the far side of the post office, 3 minutes from Edith Polworthy's cottage by the lane and 5 by the road, which is the distinction that matters in villages, where the lane route and the road route carry entirely different social meanings, and people choose between them accordingly. The lane route passes the churchyard, the road route passes the greengrocer and the haberdashery, and the bench outside the King's Head where old Mr. Salter sat regardless of weather. Clara had taken the lane route every morning for 2 years and would, Miss Marple suspected, take some time before she was comfortable doing so again. She arrived at the Burse house at 11 o'clock with a pot of her quince jelly, because she had given away all her greengage preserve earlier in the week, and the quince was the next best thing, and also because it was slightly less common than greengage and therefore communicated a slightly higher degree of special attention. Which felt appropriate. Mrs. Burse answered the door, a comfortable woman of 50 with flour on her apron, who looked at Miss Marple with the particular expression that people in St. Mary Mead wore when they opened their door to find her standing there, which was a combination of genuine pleasure and a kind of reflexive anxiety, as though pleased company and unsettling news had become, over the years, so consistently associated in the village mind that it was now difficult to experience one without anticipating the other. "Clara's in the sitting room," said Mrs. Burse. "She's not been out since yesterday. The doctor says rest, but she won't sleep." Miss Marple said she understood completely and would not stay long. Sacked, and she was shown into a small warm sitting room where Clara Burse sat in an armchair beside the fire with a blanket over her knees, and the look of a young woman who has seen something she cannot stop seeing, and has not yet found the mental furniture to put it down somewhere manageable. She was 19, with dark hair and precise, capable hands that she was currently holding very still in her lap as though keeping them occupied would help. She looked up when Miss Marple came in, and her expression shifted into something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it, the look of someone who's been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for a particular person to arrive. "Miss Marple," she said. "My dear Clara." Miss Marple sat in the chair across from her without ceremony. "I brought you some quince jelly. I know it's a strange time for jelly, but I find the ordinary things help more than people give them credit for." Clara looked at the jar and then at Miss Marple, and she said, with the directness of someone too tired for the usual social padding, "You don't think it was an accident?" "No," said Miss Marple. A silence. The fire settled. Outside, a cart horse went past in the lane, its hooves muffled by the damp February earth. "Neither do I," said Clara. "The pin. She would never have left a pin standing." "Tell me about that," said Miss Marple gently. "Tell me exactly how she worked. Don't leave out anything you think might be too small to matter, because in my experience there is no such thing as too small." Clara drew a breath and began, and Miss Marple listened in the particular way she had, which looked like comfortable inattention, and was in fact the most focused attention she was capable of. Edith Polworthy's method, Clara explained, was the result of 40 years of accumulated professional habit, and like all such habits it had the quality of being invisible to the person who practiced it. felt rather than chosen, the way a right-handed person does not decide which hand to use. She laid her pins parallel to the seam, flat to the fabric, never upright, and she removed them as she sewed, taking each one out a stitch before the machine foot reached it. She pinned from right to left always, working across the body of the garment. She held her pincushion on her left wrist like a bracelet, a pincushion her mother had made her, a small red tomato shape on an elastic band, worn thin with years. She never left work on the bench without removing the pins first, even when she stepped away for just a moment, the way a carpenter puts down a chisel safely before crossing the room. She said, Clara added, that a pin left standing is a pin waiting to cause harm. She said that the first time I met her, and she said it quite regularly afterwards. It was a rule she felt strongly about. "And the morning you found her," said Miss Marple, "the pin was standing upright in the fabric she was working on. Yes, in a piece of grey wool. Clerical cloth, I thought, because of the weight and colour of it. She had a vestment project on, I knew that, though she hadn't told me exactly who it was for." Clara paused. "The pin was standing at an angle, not quite vertical, more like this," and she demonstrated with her finger, tilted about 20 degrees from upright, as though someone had pushed it in from above rather than sliding it in flat from the side. Miss Marple looked at the demonstration with great attention. "Yes," she said. "Yes, that is very helpful, Clara." "There were other things," said Clara, and she said it with the slight hesitation of someone who has been thinking about whether to say this and has decided that the time for that kind of hesitation is past. "Tell me," said Miss Marple. "The chair was wrong. Her workbench chair. She kept it, at a specific height. She'd adjusted the legs herself years ago, cut them down so that her elbows were exactly level with the bench surface when she sat. She was very particular about it because of her back. But when I came in that morning, the chair was further from the bench than it should have been, pushed back by perhaps 6 or 8 inches, and the angle was off, turned slightly to the left." Miss Marple was very still. "As though someone taller had been sitting in it," she said. "That's what I thought," said Clara. "Someone taller, who sat differently at the bench, and pushed the chair back to accommodate their legs." "And the thimble?" said Miss Marple. Clara looked at her sharply. "How did you know about the thimble?" "I didn't," said Miss Marple. "I was asking in case there was something about it." "Was there?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "It was on her right hand," she said. "She always wore it on her left. Always, without exception. I'd never seen it otherwise. When I found her, the thimble was on the middle finger of her right hand." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Burse was moving about, the domestic percussion of someone keeping busy because the alternative is to think too clearly about what has happened. Miss Marple sat with these 3 things and arranged them in her mind the way she arranged complex knitting patterns, holding the whole structure steady while she examined each individual element. The pin wrong in its placement, the chair wrong in its position, the thimble wrong in its hand. None of these things, taken individually, was conclusive. A woman who fell asleep might shift her chair. A thimble might be on the wrong finger for any number of reasons. A pin might, in the extremity of sudden illness, be left standing rather than laid flat. But all 3 together told a story of someone else's presence at that workbench. Someone who had arranged the scene of an accidental death, and had done it with reasonable care and considerable speed, but who had not known Edith Polworthy's habits well enough to replicate them. Someone who knew that Edith used a thimble, but not which hand. Someone who knew that she worked with pins, but not how she placed them. Someone who knew the broad outline of her craft without knowing its specific grammar, the private language of 40 years of practice that only those who had watched her closely could read. The coroner from Radchester had not read it. Miss Marple read it without difficulty. "Clara," she said, in the tone of someone moving carefully toward the thing she most needs to know. "The vestment piece. The grey clerical cloth. Do you know whose it was?" Clara thought for a moment. "She hadn't told me directly, but I'd seen the measurements on her notepad, the ones she keeps beside the bench for reference. I recognised the notation because I'd been learning her system. The measurements were for a tall man, broad across the shoulders, and there was a name initial at the top of the page." Miss Marple waited. "A capital C," said Clara. "Just the one letter. She always used just the first letter of the surname for her regular customers, the ones she'd had for years. It was a shorthand she'd developed." Miss Marple said nothing. She looked at the fire. She turned her knitting 2 rows without appearing to think about it. A capital C, and in St. Mary Mead, among Edith Polworthy's long-standing regular customers of a tall, broad-shouldered build, there was one person whose surname began with C, and who would have been measured for clerical vestments, the Reverend Gerald Clement. But she did not say this, not yet. Saying things before one is ready to say them was, in her experience, one of the more reliable ways of causing them to become unprovable. "You've been very helpful, Clara," she said instead. "More helpful than you know. I want you to do one thing for me, and it is a simple thing. I want you to write down everything you have told me this morning as precisely as you can remember it, with dates where you know them, and keep it somewhere safe. Not on the premises of the cottage, and not in a place that anyone who might visit your home would have easy access to. Can you do that?" Clara looked at her steadily. She was 19, and she had found her employer dead, and she had known for 2 days that something was wrong, and no one official had listened, and now someone was agreeing with her, and the relief of that was visible in the slight loosening around her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." "Good," said Miss Marple. She rose, smoothed her coat, tucked her knitting into her bag. "And Clara, if anyone asks what we spoke about this morning, which they may not, but if they do, we spoke about your memories of your time with Miss Polworthy, which is entirely true." She left the quince jelly on the side table, said goodbye to Mrs. Burse in the kitchen, and walked back along the lane toward the village, past the churchyard wall, past the back boundary of Edith Polworthy's cottage garden, past the iron boot scraper at the side gate where, she noticed as she passed, a single thread of dark wool was still caught on the uppermost edge of the iron, fine as a whisper, the colour of winter cloud, and, if she was not mistaken, the precise shade and weight of clerical cloth. She did not stop. She did not touch it. She walked on at her usual pace, her face entirely pleasant, her mind running very fast indeed. A capital C, a thread of dark wool, a bootprint pointing in and not pointing out, and she needed to speak to Dr. Haydock before the thread was disturbed by weather, or by the feet of whoever might pass through that gate next. Chapter 4. The Thread on the Boot Scraper. Friends, we are at the moment in every mystery where the evidence is fragile and the window is closing. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever known something to be true without yet being able to prove it, and felt the specific frustration of watching time work against you? Tell us in the comments. Miss Marple knows that feeling very well, and she has learned over a long life that the answer to it is not urgency. It is precision. Dr. Haydock was in his surgery until noon. Miss Marple knew this because she knew the surgery hours as she knew all the reliable rhythms of the village, not from any deliberate effort of memorization, but from the accumulated knowledge of years of proximity. The way one comes to know the timetable of a familiar train not by studying it but by having caught it often enough. She arrived at his garden gate at 5 minutes past 12, when the last patient of the morning had departed, and he was still in the process of putting away his instruments and wondering, she suspected, whether to have lunch before or after his afternoon calls. He looked at her over the gate with the expression she had come to think of as his Miss Marple expression, which was distinct from all his other expressions and which combined wariness, respect, and a kind of resigned readiness. The look of a man who knows that what follows will be demanding and important and probably, in the end, correct. "Miss Marple," he said. "I need 10 minutes, she said, "and I need your bag." He looked at her for a moment. "Edith Polworthy," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. He opened the gate. Inside, over a lunch that Mrs. Haydock produced with the cheerful efficiency of a woman, accustomed to her husband's irregular hours and irregular visitors, Miss Marple told him what she had. Not all of it. The parts that required immediate action. The pin, the chair, the thimble, the thread on the boot scraper. She told it in the precise sequential way she had, without commentary or interpretation, simply the facts in the order she had gathered them, because Haydock was a man who needed to travel from evidence to conclusion himself, and resisted being driven there by someone else's reasoning, which she respected. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued about him. When she'd finished, he was quiet for a moment, and cutting his bread into careful halves in the way that meant he was thinking. "The thread," he said. "You're sure of the cloth?" "I've been looking at clerical cloth on the Reverend Clement's vestments every Sunday for 20 years, said Miss Marple. "I am quite sure." Another silence. Outside, a blackbird tried a tentative phrase in the garden, and then thought better of it. "I attended the inquest," said Haydock. "I didn't examine the body myself. Henderson did. He's the county coroner, and he's competent enough, But he didn't know Edith, and I think he may have let the obvious explanation carry more weight than it deserved. Yes, said Miss Marple. I think that is exactly what happened. The pin alone wouldn't have been enough, said Haydock slowly, even if I'd been the one to examine her. A standing pin in a woman who was found slumped at her workbench. It's improbable. I'd have noted it as improbable. But improbable and impossible are different things. But the pin and the chair and the thimble together, said Miss Marple. Together, he agreed. They describe something that was arranged. Someone who understood the general shape of what a seamstress's death at her workbench should look like, but who didn't know the specific grammar of this particular seamstress. He looked at her. You need me to go and look at the thread before it disappears. Before this afternoon's rain, said Miss Marple, glancing at the window, where the February sky had been developing in tension since 11 o'clock. And I need you to look at it as a doctor who's making a professional observation about potential evidence. Not as a man who knocked on a gate with a friend. Haydock understood the distinction. He finished his lunch. He collected his bag, not because he needed it, but because a doctor carrying his bag on Vicarage Lane had a naturalness to it, that a doctor simply looking at a boot scraper did not. He put on his coat and his hat, and they walked together along the road to Vicarage Lane at the pace of two people taking a constitutional, which is what they were, among other things. The thread was still there. It was, as Miss Marple had said, caught on the uppermost edge of the iron boot scraper at the side gate of Edith Polworthy's cottage. A single fibre of dark wool approximately 2 inches long, the kind of thread that catches when cloth brushes against iron at a particular angle. When someone moves through a gate in a hurry or in darkness and does not feel the small resistance of it snagging. Haydock looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he took a small envelope from his bag, the kind he carried for samples, and with a pair of fine forceps he removed the thread and placed it in the envelope and sealed it. I'll compare it against a sample of clerical cloth, he said. I have a contact at the county laboratory, unofficially, for now. Thank you, said Miss Marple. They stood for a moment at the gate. The churchyard lay beyond the wall to their right, its stones grey and patient in the flat February light. The church tower of St. Bartholomew's was visible above the yew trees, solid and permanent, the kind of permanence that makes certain things feel impossible. Gerald Clement, said Haydock, in the tone of a man testing a thought by saying it aloud. I have not yet said so, said Miss Marple. No, said Haydock, but the thread is from the gate beside his churchyard wall, and Edith had a vestment project in progress for a regular customer, whose surname initial was C, and the chair at the workbench was pushed back for someone tall and broad, and Gerald Clement is the tallest man in this parish. He paused. I have known Gerald Clement for 20 years. Yes, said Miss Marple, and there was nothing more to say about that because there never was, and she had learned not to try. They walked back along the lane. At the corner before they separated, she stopped. Haydock, she said, the inquest verdict. Is it possible to have it reconsidered? He thought about this carefully, in the way he thought about medical questions, armed with the respect for complexity that distinguished him from less conscientious men. If new evidence comes to light that materially contradicts the original findings, yes, the coroner can be petitioned to reopen. It requires someone with standing to bring the petition, ideally a medical opinion supporting it, and evidence that is specific and documented rather than observational. The thread, said Miss Marple. Clara's written account of the 3 anomalies, and anything else that presents itself between now and then. How much time do you think we have? Said Haydock. Miss Marple considered this, looking down the lane toward the church tower above the yews. Not a great deal, she said. Someone removed that envelope from Edith's bureau before Philip Polworthy arrived on Wednesday evening. That person knows the envelope is gone. What they do not yet know is whether the name on it was seen by anyone else before it was taken. As long as they believe the name died with Edith, they feel relatively safe. The moment they suspect otherwise, everything accelerates. And does anyone else know the name? I don't know the name myself yet, said Miss Marple, not with certainty, but I am going to find it, and I think I know who can tell me, though they won't know they're telling me, which is generally the most reliable kind of information. She adjusted her hat against the freshening wind and picked up her bag. Tomorrow morning, she said. Come to tea. I should have considerably more to tell you by then. She walked away toward the village. Haydock stood at the corner and watched her go, a small and unhurried figure in a good wool coat moving through the grey February afternoon with the composed purposefulness of someone who has a great deal to do and has already decided how to do it. Behind her, The first drops of rain began to fall on Vicarage Lane, darkening the stones of the path, running in thin streams along the edge of the churchyard wall, washing clean the place on the boot scraper where the thread had been. 2 hours earlier, and it would have been gone. Miss Marple, who had the habit of arriving at the right moment because she made it her business to understand what the right moment was, had arrived with 2 hours to spare. But she was not yet satisfied. The thread was physical evidence of presence. It was not yet evidence of guilt. For that, she needed the name on the envelope, and behind the name, the story that connected Edith Polworthy's knowledge to the Reverend Gerald Clement's fear, the story that had made a Tuesday evening in February necessary. She turned up her collar against the rain. She knew already where she was going next. Chapter 5. The Widow in Torquay. Friends, we have reached the chapter that changes everything. Up until now we have been gathering the instruments of what happened and where and how. But this chapter is about why, and why, in Miss Marple's experience, is always where the true weight of a story lives. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted had caused harm to another person, quietly and over time, and then continued their ordinary life as though it had not happened? Tell us in the comments, because that is precisely what Miss Marple is about to uncover. She went, that afternoon, to see Miss Hartnell. Miss Violet Hartnell was 71 years old and had lived in St Mary Mead since birth, which gave her a seniority in village knowledge that was rivalled only by Miss Marple herself. And in certain specific areas, particularly the financial histories of the village's more prominent families, surpassed even her. Miss Hartnell had a nephew who worked in county banking, and who had, over the years, mentioned things to his aunt with the slightly careless confidence of a young man who does not fully appreciate his aunt's talent for retention. She was also a committed correspondent, maintaining active epistolary relationships with women in 6 surrounding villages and 3 distant towns, one of which, it happened, was Torquay. Miss Marple arrived at Miss Hartnell's house at 2:30 with her knitting, and without the greengage preserve or the quince jelly or the seed cake, because she had exhausted her immediate supply of social provisions, and because Miss Hartnell was not the sort of woman who needed softening. She was blunt, good-hearted, occasionally infuriating, and she had the memory of a woman who has never had children to distract her from accumulating everything else. They sat in Miss Hartnell's front room, which was warm and slightly overcrowded with furniture and entirely comfortable, and they drank strong tea, and Miss Marple asked, with the air of someone following a thread of general conversation, about the Ashworth family. Miss Hartnell's expression sharpened immediately, which told Miss Marple she had found the right door. The Ashworths, Miss Hartnell confirmed, had been a perfectly respectable family in the village of Wetherton, 6 miles from St Mary Mead, until approximately 8 years ago. Edwin Ashworth had been a solicitor's clerk, steady and careful, who had invested his savings in a small commercial venture on the recommendation of a man he trusted entirely, a man of some standing in the community, a man whose word Edwin Ashworth had not thought to question, because people of that type were not, in Edwin Ashworth's experience, the kind of people whose word one questioned. The venture had failed. More than failed. It had collapsed in a manner that suggested to those who looked closely afterward that it had been constructed partly on misrepresentation, that certain facts about its financial foundation had been presented to investors in a way that was technically not quite false, but was, in the way that mattered, thoroughly dishonest. Edwin Ashworth had lost everything. His savings, his confidence, and within 18 months, his health. He had died of a heart complaint at 54, and leaving his wife Margaret and their daughter Frances in the reduced circumstances that follow when a careful man's careful life is dismantled by someone else's dishonesty. Margaret Ashworth was now in Torquay. Frances was with her, unmarried, working as a bookkeeper for a small hotel. They managed. They did not complain by all accounts. But they lived a very different life from the one they had been building. And the man who recommended the investment, said Miss Marple, in the tone of someone asking a question to which she already suspects the answer. Miss Hartnell's expression did something complex. That was never established formally, she said. Edwin didn't pursue it. He was too ill by the time anyone thought to look carefully, and Margaret didn't have the means or the stomach for a legal fight. The man in question was... Well, she stopped, set her cup down. He was a man of considerable standing, the sort of person one doesn't accuse without absolute proof and the resources to withstand the consequences of being wrong. Or the consequences of being right, said Miss Marple quietly. Yes, said Miss Hartnell, that too. Did Edith Polworthy know the Ashworths? Said Miss Marple. Miss Hartnell looked at her then with the direct assessing look of a woman who has just understood that this conversation has been going somewhere specific since it began. She might have done, she said carefully. Margaret Ashworth's sister lived in this village for some years. They visited. Edith would have met them. And the man of considerable standing, said Miss Marple. His surname? Would it begin with C? A very long pause. Miss Marple, said Miss Hartnell slowly. What exactly are you suggesting? I am not suggesting anything, said Miss Marple. I am asking whether the surname of the man whose recommendation destroyed the Ashworth family begins with the letter C. Because I believe Edith Polworthy knew something about that man, something she had been carrying for 8 years, and I believe she had recently decided that the time for carrying it was over, and I believe that decision cost her her life. The room was very quiet. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon had arrived properly now, running down the windows in grey sheets, and the fire had the deep, settled warmth of a room closed against winter weather. Miss Hartnell looked at her hands. She looked at the fire. She looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a woman who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and finds that her arms have grown tired. Clement, she said. Gerald Clement. He was not yet a vicar then. He was a curate at Wetherton, with a certain amount of private money and a great deal of social confidence, and the particular kind of charm that makes people trust a man before they have any evidence that he deserves it. She stopped. I have sat in his church every Sunday for 6 years, and I have put money in his collection plate, and I have found him, genuinely, to be a good man in many respects, which makes this, she looked at Miss Marple, very difficult. Yes, said Miss Marple, it does. Good men who do harmful things are considerably more complicated than straightforwardly bad ones. But the harm is no less real for that. Edith knew, said Miss Hartnell. I suspected she might. She altered his vestments for years, and she never said a word to anyone. But Edith knew things the way still water knows the shape of the ground beneath it, silently and completely. She was writing to Margaret Ashworth, said Miss Marple, to tell her what she knew, after 8 years. Why now? Said Miss Hartnell. Miss Marple thought about this. She thought about Edith Polworthy's purposefulness in those final weeks, the sense of a decision being arrived at, the letters to write. She thought about what changes in a woman of 67 that makes her decide, after 8 years of silence, that the time for silence is finished. I think, she said, that she was ill. I think Edith Polworthy knew she was ill, and understood that if she did not write the letter now she never would, and that Margaret Ashworth would never know what had been done to her family, and that Gerald Clement would continue to stand in his pulpit and take his collection and be, as you say, genuinely good in many respects. And the thing beneath it would simply go on being buried, as things are buried when the only person who knows them decides that the complications of speaking are too great. Miss Hartnell was very still. Was she ill? I don't know for certain, said Miss Marple, but it would explain the decision, and it would explain why she chose that particular Tuesday. When Clara went home early, when she had the evening to herself, she paused. She was not murdered because she had told anyone. She was murdered because she had written a name on an envelope and the wrong person had seen her do it. She finished her tea, she gathered her knitting. She stood, and Miss Hartnell stood with her, and they looked at each other across the small warm room with the rain on the windows and the fire between them. What will you do? Said Miss Hartnell. I need one more thing, said Miss Marple. I need to know whether Edith was indeed ill, and if so, whether her doctor knew it, because that will confirm the timing and close the last gap in what I can take to Inspector Slack. She paused at the thought of Inspector Slack, which produced in her the familiar compound of respect and exasperation. And then I shall need your help, not in an official capacity. In the capacity of a woman who has known this village for 71 years, and who understands that certain things, once set in motion, need to be set in motion with enough weight behind them to reach their proper conclusion. Miss Hartnell looked at her steadily. You shall have it, she said. Miss Marple nodded. She put on her coat and her hat and her gloves, and she walked out into the rain with the particular unhurried composure of a woman who has, in the course of an afternoon's visiting, dismantled a lie that had stood for 8 years, and is now simply deciding the order in which to dismantle it properly. Behind her, in the warm room, Miss Hartnell sat back down. She looked at the fire for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and began a letter to a woman in Torquay to tell her before anything else happened, like that someone in St. Mary Mead had not forgotten. Chapter 6. Dr. Warren's Records. Friends, we're approaching the final turn of the mystery now, the place where suspicion becomes certainty. Before we go in, I have a question for you. Have you ever watched someone carry a secret so long that the carrying of it became, to them, simply ordinary life? Tell us in the comments, because that is what we're about to discover about Gerald Clement, and about the woman who finally decided his secret had been ordinary long enough. Dr. Warren was not Dr. Haydock. This is worth establishing at the outset because the two men occupied the same professional role in adjacent territories and were frequently, by those who did not know them well, conflated into a single idea of what a village doctor was. Dr. Haydock was Miss Marple's doctor, the doctor of the eastern side of St. Mary Mead and its surrounds, a large, comfortable, perceptive man who had delivered half the village and buried a considerable portion of it, and taken both activities with the same measured equanimity. Dr. Warren served the western side, a smaller, more precise man of 52, whose manner was efficient rather than warm, who kept meticulous records and ran his surgery with the clockwork regularity of someone who believes that medicine, properly practiced, should have the qualities of a well-maintained machine. He was also, as it happened, Edith Polworthy's doctor. Miss Marple arrived at his surgery at 9 o'clock on Friday morning, which was the first available appointment she'd been able to secure by telephone the previous evening, and she sat in his waiting room for 6 minutes among the coughs and the anxious faces of the ordinary sick. And she was shown in at 9 minutes past. She told him, plainly and without preamble, that she had reason to believe Edith Polworthy had not died accidentally, that she was working to bring this to the attention of the appropriate authorities, and that she needed to know whether Edith had been suffering from any condition in the weeks before her death that might have influenced her decision to write certain letters she had previously postponed. Dr. Warren looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man being asked to do something that sits at the edge of his professional obligations and requires him to determine on which side of the edge it falls. "I cannot discuss a patient's medical history," he said. "No," said Miss Marple, "not under ordinary circumstances, but if Edith Polworthy was murdered, as I believe she was, then her medical history may be material to establishing the motive behind her death, and withholding it, even from the best professional motives, may allow the person responsible to remain undiscovered." She paused. "I am not asking you to tell me anything you would not be prepared to tell Inspector Slack. I am simply asking you to tell me first, so that I can determine whether what you know is what I need, before I bring a formal request that would make this a matter of official record and therefore considerably more complicated for everyone involved." Dr. Warren considered this for a moment. He straightened a pen on his desk. He looked at the window. He looked back at Miss Marple. "Edith Polworthy," he said carefully, "had been my patient for 11 years. She came to see me in November of last year. She was not, as a rule, a frequent visitor to this surgery. She managed her health with the same self-sufficient competence she brought to everything else." He stopped, straightened another pen. "In November," he continued, "she came because she had been experiencing symptoms she could not attribute to ordinary causes. I ran tests. The results indicated a progressive cardiac condition, not immediately life-threatening but significant, the kind that alters one's calculations about the future." He looked at Miss Marple steadily. "I told her what I found. She received it with complete composure. She asked me 2 questions, how long, and whether there was any treatment that would substantially alter the answer to the first question. I told her the probable range of years, which was not short but was not indefinite, and I told her that treatment could manage the symptoms but not the underlying progression. She thanked me. She went home. She did not come back for a follow-up appointment, which I noted and intended to pursue." "She died in February," said Miss Marple. 3 months after that conversation." "Yes," said Dr. Warren. "Not of the cardiac condition. I want to be clear about that. The condition would not have killed her on that particular Tuesday evening. Whatever happened on that Tuesday evening was not natural." Miss Marple looked at him. "You suspected." "I noted certain things at the time of the inquest that I found irregular," he said. "I was not asked to examine the body. Henderson conducted the examination and reached his verdict. I attended as an observer, not in a professional capacity, and what I observed was not, I felt, sufficient to contradict a coroner's finding on its own." He paused. I have been uncomfortable about it since. You will be asked to give a formal statement, said Miss Marple, about the cardiac diagnosis in November, about the timing and what it implies about her state of mind and her motivation to act on something she had been holding for 8 years, and about your reservations regarding the inquest finding. He nodded slowly. I will give it. Miss Marple rose. At the door she paused, in the way she did when the last and most important thing was about to be said. The cardiac diagnosis, she said. Would it have been apparent to Edith in how she felt from day to day that her time was becoming finite in a new way? Yes, said Dr. Warren simply. She would have known. Not from pain necessarily, not at that stage, but from the quality of her energy, from the way the body begins, very quietly, to conduct its own reckoning. Miss Marple thanked him and left. She stood on the pavement outside his surgery in the cold February morning and felt the last piece of the motive fall into place with the particular quiet satisfaction of a thing that was always going to be true now confirmed. Edith Polworthy had received her diagnosis in November. She had spent December and January making her decision. In February she'd sent Clara home early on a Tuesday evening and sat down to write a letter to Margaret Ashworth in Torquay, to tell her, before her own time ran out, what had been done to her family and who had done it. And Gerald Clement, who had seen her addressing that envelope, had understood in the space of a few seconds what 8 years of careful management was about to unravel, and had made, in those same few seconds, the worst decision of his life. She walked toward the village. The morning was cold and clear, the overnight rain gone, the February light doing what February light does, which is to illuminate everything without warming anything. She thought about Gerald Clement. She thought about him with the careful, unsentimental clarity she brought to people who had done terrible things while also being, in other genuine respects, quite good. She had known him for 20 years. She had found him kind and thoughtful, and possessed of a real feeling for his congregation that was not merely professional. She thought of Mr. Emmett, who had run the Sunday school in this village for 15 years, or a man whose goodness was perfectly real and also perfectly convenient. The two things are not incompatible, she knew, but they do make it considerably harder to see what lies beneath. Gerald Clement's goodness was real. The thing beneath it was also real. Both facts had to be held at once, and neither one diminished the other, and it was necessary to act on the second without being distracted by the first. She had one more thing to do before she was ready. She needed to speak to Clement himself, not to accuse him, not yet, but to see him, and to say certain things in his presence and watch what those things produced in his face, because she had found over a long life that guilt, in intelligent people, expressed itself not in obvious signs but in the smallest possible adjustments, the micro-calibrations of a person managing the gap between what they know and what they are showing, and she had become, through long practice, very good at reading those adjustments. She turned toward the vicarage. The church tower rose above the yews, solid and grey and permanent against the winter sky. She walked toward it. Chapter 7. The Vicar's Study. Friends. We have arrived at the chapter I've been thinking about since we began. This is the conversation at the heart of everything, and I want to ask you something before we go in. When you know someone has done something terrible and you sit across from them and look at them, and they look back at you, what do you feel? Not what should you feel. What do you actually feel? Tell us in the comments. Miss Marple has her own answer, and it might surprise you. The vicarage of St. Bartholomew's stood behind a screen of bare copper beech on the north side of the church, a substantial Victorian house that had been built with the confident assumption that the Church of England would always require a great deal of space, and which had not been much altered since. It had high ceilings and long windows and the particular chill of a large house that is heated only in its occupied rooms, so that moving from the study to the hallway was to cross from one climate into another. The Reverend Gerald Clement answered the door himself, which meant his housekeeper was out, which was either a coincidence or not. He was a tall man, as tall as Miss Marple had always known him to be, broad across the shoulders, with the bearing of someone who has been at the centre of communal life for long enough that a certain natural authority has settled into his posture without his having sought it. He had a pleasant, open face that had aged well, and grey hair that had been very dark once, and eyes of a particular warm brown that were, she had always thought, his most effective social instrument. And he looked at her with those eyes now, and the warmth in them was real, she was certain of that. The warmth was entirely genuine. That was the thing about Gerald Clement. He was not performing goodness. He was good. And he had also done this. "Miss Marple," he said, "come in, please. It's bitter this morning." She was shown into his study, which was the room she had expected, a room of books and papers and the comfortable accumulation of a working life, a fire going in the grate, 2 chairs set at angles to it in the way that suggested he spent time here with parishioners, which she knew he did. He made tea himself without fuss and brought it on a tray, and sat across from her with the ease of a man in his own space who has no reason to be uncomfortable. She had thought about how to begin this. She had decided on the walk from Dr. Warren's surgery that the only method that might produce what she needed was the one that felt most exposed, which was to say something true, directly, and watch what it cost him to respond to it. "I've been thinking a great deal about Edith Polworthy," she said. His expression did not change. "As have we all," he said, with the warmth he brought to all pastoral matters. "A dreadful thing. She will be very much missed. 40 years of service to this community." "Yes," said Miss Marple. She held her teacup in both hands and looked at the fire. "I've been thinking particularly about the vestment work she was doing in the days before she died. Clara tells me she had a project on, clerical cloth, for a regular customer. Dear, I imagine that will need to be finished by someone else now." A pause that lasted perhaps half a second longer than it should have. "I hadn't thought about it," he said. "I suppose you're right, though it hardly seems the moment to be concerned with vestments." "No," agreed Miss Marple. "No, of course not. These things keep, after all." She turned her teacup slightly in its saucer. She was a remarkable woman, very discreet. In 30 years of fitting and altering for half the village, I never once heard her repeat a confidence. She heard a great deal, of course. One does, in that profession, but she was absolutely trustworthy. The word trustworthy landed in the room and sat there. His hand, which had been resting on the arm of his chair, moved slightly. Not much. The very smallest rearrangement of the fingers. "She was," he said. "An admirable quality." "She had been thinking about the Ashworth family," said Miss Marple in exactly the same conversational tone as everything preceding it. "I know she had. She mentioned them to Clara a few weeks ago. Margaret Ashworth in Torquay. Do you remember the Ashworths? Edwin Ashworth was a solicitor's clerk at Wetherton. He died some years ago." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. The bare copper beech outside the long window moved slightly in the wind. Gerald Clement looked at her. Miss Marple looked at the fire. She was counting internally the seconds of silence, because the length of the silence was information. A man with nothing to fear would have said something within 2 or 3 seconds. The silence went to 7. "I believe I may have met them," he said. "Through parish connections at Wetherton, many years ago." "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "That's what I thought. You were at Wetherton, weren't you, before you came here, as a curate?" "For 3 years," he said. His voice was steady. His voice was extremely steady, and the effort of making it so was the most legible thing about him at this moment. "Edwin Ashworth lost a great deal of money on an investment recommendation from someone he trusted at that time," said Miss Marple, still looking at the fire, her voice still entirely conversational, the voice of a woman discussing a sad story from the past with a sympathetic listener. "It ruined them, really. He died of it, in a way. Margaret and Frances have managed in Torquay since then, a reduced life, a hard one, though they don't complain." She let that sit. So she turned and looked at him then, directly, with the full, clear attention she kept behind her pleasant expression, and she looked at him the way she looked at difficult things, steadily and without flinching, and she saw in his face the thing she had come to see. Not panic. Gerald Clement was too intelligent and too controlled for panic. What she saw was the thing beneath panic, the specific quality of a man who has lived for 8 years with a weight he convinced himself he could carry and who has just understood, in the space of a conversation about tea and vestments and a widow in Torquay, that the carrying is over. It was not, she thought, entirely without relief. "Miss Marple," he said. His voice was quiet. Something in it had changed, very slightly, the professional pastoral warmth replaced by something more stripped, more honest. "What are you doing?" "I am telling you," she said, "what I know, and what Dr. Haydock knows, and what Dr. Warren will shortly be asked to provide in a formal statement, and what Clara Burse has written down, very precisely, about 3 specific things she observed at Edith Polworthy's workbench on the morning she found her." She paused. and I am telling you before Inspector Slack is involved, so that you have the opportunity to think about how you wish to proceed, because Inspector Slack is a thorough man and will reach the same conclusions by a less gentle route, and the manner in which this comes to light will matter a great deal, not to the fact of it, which is fixed, but to the people surrounding it, your congregation, the Ashworths. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the copper beech outside the window moved twice in the wind before he spoke. "I didn't intend," he began, and stopped. "No," said Miss Marple, "I don't think you did. I think you went to the cottage on Tuesday evening because you had seen her addressing the envelope, and you needed to speak to her, to explain, to appeal perhaps to the discretion she had shown for 8 years, and ask her to continue it. And I think something went wrong in that conversation, or what you found when you arrived made you understand that speaking would not be enough, and you made a decision that you have been living with since Tuesday, and I think the living with it has not been easy." He looked at his hands. They were, she noted, the hands of a tall man, broad-palmed. The hands that had sat in a chair pushed back from Edith Polworthy's workbench, that had not known which hand she wore her thimble on, that had placed a pin upright in the fabric with the too deliberate care of someone arranging a scene they had only imagined and not observed. "The Ashworths," he said after a long time. "Will they know?" "Margaret Ashworth will already have received a letter from Miss Hartnell," said Miss Marple quietly. "Not the details, but enough to know that someone is looking into what happened to her husband and why. That letter went yesterday afternoon." He closed his eyes briefly. "Then it is already beyond stopping," he said. "It was always beyond stopping," said Miss Marple. "From the moment Edith Polworthy received her diagnosis in November and decided she would not leave the world without setting it right. It was beyond stopping then. Tuesday evening only determined the manner of its coming to light, not whether it would." She set down her teacup, she picked up her bag. She rose. "I would suggest," she said, "that you speak to a solicitor today, and that you be at home this afternoon because Dr. Haydock will be contacting Inspector Slack this morning, and I expect the inspector will wish to call on you before the day is out." She paused. "I have known you for 20 years, Gerald. I have respected a great deal about you. I think you know that what I am doing now is also a form of that respect." He looked at her from his chair beside the fire, a large man made suddenly smaller by the accuracy of being seen, and he nodded once very slightly. She left the vicarage. She walked along the path between the copper beeches, and through the churchyard gate, past the headstones grey and patient in the February light, and she came out onto Vicarage Lane and turned toward home. She did not feel triumph. She never did at this point. She felt the particular weight of a thing rightly done and not pleasantly done, the weight of necessity which is quite different from satisfaction and considerably more honest. She thought about Gerald Clement in his study beside his fire. She thought about Margaret Ashworth in Torquay, and the letter that had already arrived, or would arrive, and what it would feel like to read it after 8 years. She thought about Edith Polworthy, who had measured the village for 30 years and said nothing and known everything, and at the end decided that knowing and saying nothing was a luxury she could no longer afford. She walked home through the cold February morning. She had 1 chapter left to write, she thought, and she knew already how it would read. Chapter 8. Inspector Slack and the Weight of Evidence. Friends, we have reached the chapter where the machinery of justice, having been shown what to look at and where to look, begins to turn. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Do you think justice and truth are the same thing? Or do you think they are 2 different destinations that sometimes share a road? Tell us in the comments. Miss Marple has thought about this question for a very long time, and her answer is more complicated than you might expect. Inspector Slack arrived at the vicarage at 3:30 on Friday afternoon. Miss Marple knew this because she heard his motor car from her sitting-room window, and because the particular sound of an official motor car arriving with purpose on a quiet Friday afternoon carries through a village the way very few sounds do. Not loudly, but completely, so that people who could not have said how they knew it came to know it within the hour. By Friday evening, the village knew that the inspector had called on the Reverend Clement. By Saturday morning it knew, in the approximate and careful way that villagers come to know things before they are confirmed, that the call had not been a pastoral matter. Miss Marple did not concern herself with what the village knew. She concerned herself with what had happened in the vicarage study after she left, which she reconstructed from Haydock, who had spoken to Slack, who had spoken to no one officially but had, as was his habit, spoken to Haydock in the practical partnership they had maintained through several previous cases without either of them acknowledging it as a partnership. Gerald Clement had not, when Slack arrived, offered any resistance. This was both what Miss Marple had anticipated and something she understood went beyond the merely practical. A man of Clement's intelligence and Clement's particular relationship with his own conscience would have known, from the moment Miss Marple rose from his fireside chair and put on her coat, that resistance was no longer the appropriate response. He had been a man managing a wait for 8 years, and the management had required constant effort, the daily effort of being one thing in the world and another thing in his own knowledge, and when Miss Marple sat across from him and named the wait precisely, the management became, she thought, simply too tiring to continue. He had made a statement. He had done it without a solicitor present, which his solicitor would subsequently describe as an error of judgment, but which Miss Marple considered, in the privacy of her own assessment, to be the first genuinely uncalculated thing he had done since the Tuesday evening, when he had walked through a gate in the dark and let a thread of wool catch on an iron boot scraper. The statement confirmed what she had assembled from the outside. He had gone to the cottage at 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening. He had seen Edith through the workroom window before knocking, sitting at her bench with the envelope before her, writing the address in her careful hand. He had seen enough of the name to understand what he was seeing and who it was going to. He had knocked. She had let him in because Edith Polworthy was not a woman who turned people from her door, even people whose presence she had perhaps half expected, because she had, it was now clear, known this moment might come. They had spoken for a considerable time. He had appealed to her discretion, to the years of it, to the relationship of trust they had maintained. She had listened with the composed attention she brought to everything, and had told him, without drama, that she was writing the letter and would post it in the morning, and that this was not something she was prepared to discuss further. She had said it kindly, he told Slack. That was the word he used. Kindly. He had left. He had walked as far as the churchyard gate. He had stood there for some time. He had gone back. The second visit was the one that mattered. He had found her still at the bench working on the vestment piece. The grey clerical cloth that had been hers to finish, and that she had returned to with the phlegmatic practicality of someone who sees no reason to let distress interrupt a commission. He had stood behind her. He had done what he had done with the pin from the cushion on her wrist, which she was wearing on her left hand in the place she always wore it, and he had not known, because no one who had not watched her for years would know, that the left hand was the significant thing. He had then attempted, with the limited knowledge available to a man who has never closely observed a professional seamstress at work, to arrange what was before him into something that resembled natural death. He had moved the chair back because his own legs required more room. He had placed the thimble, which had fallen on the hand nearest to him. He had left a pin standing because he did not know that standing was wrong. He had left through the side gate in the dark and caught his vestment on the boot scraper as he went, and had not felt it. When Slack asked him whether he had returned on Wednesday, before Philip Polworthy arrived, to remove the envelope from the bureau, he had said yes. He had found it unfinished, the address only partially written, the name of Margaret Ashworth but not the street. He had taken it. He had burned it that evening at the vicarage. Slack had listened to all of this in the thorough, slightly impatient way he had, writing steadily and without comment, and at the end he had asked one question that was not strictly necessary for the statement, but which was, Miss Marple thought when she heard it reported, the question of a man who is also trying to understand something. He had asked Clement whether he had known, going back through that gate the second time, what he intended to do, and Clement had said he did not know, that he did not know then, and did not know now, and that this uncertainty, this inability to locate the exact point where a possibility became a decision, was the thing he found he could not properly account for, even to himself, and perhaps particularly to himself. Slack had written this down. He had driven to Miss Marple's cottage at 5 o'clock on Friday, which she had not expected, but which did not surprise her, and she had given him tea and the remainder of the Dundee cake she had made on Thursday. And he had sat across her kitchen table with his notebook, and his air of a man conducting an official procedure who is also, in a separate and unacknowledged part of himself, grateful for the cake. He had taken her statement, all of it, in the careful sequential order she gave it, from Clara's observation about the pin on Wednesday afternoon, to the thread on the boot scraper, to Dr. Warren's confirmation of Edith's diagnosis, to the conversation in the vicarage study that morning. At the end, he had looked at his notebook and then at her with the expression she recognised from previous encounters, the expression of a man who would prefer the evidence to have arranged itself into its current configuration by some means other than the one it had actually used. "The boot scraper," he said. "You identified the thread on Wednesday afternoon." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And you had Dr. Haydock retrieve it before the rain." "Yes," rather than reporting it to the police at that point. "I reported it to Dr. Haydock," said Miss Marple, "who's a medical professional with the appropriate knowledge to assess its significance and the professional standing to present it as evidence. I thought this considerably more efficient than reporting it to the police before I was certain what it signified." Slack breathed through his nose. He wrote something down. He looked at it. He wrote something else. "The conversation with Clement this morning," he said. "You went to the vicarage before contacting the police." "I went to the vicarage to give a man the opportunity to understand his situation clearly before the official process began," said Miss Marple, "which he subsequently demonstrated he understood by giving you a complete and voluntary statement without waiting for legal counsel. I should think that simplifies your case considerably." Slack breathed through his nose again. He ate the last piece of Dundee cake. He closed his notebook. "Miss Marple," he said, in the tone of a man saying something he has said before and expects to say again, "there will come a point at which one of these investigations does not resolve itself before I arrive." "I'm sure you're right, Inspector," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Though I confess I find the waiting easier with something useful to do." He left at 6:15. She watched his motor car go down the lane from her window, and then she sat down by the fire and picked up her knitting, and permitted herself, very quietly, the thing she never permitted herself until it was genuinely over, which was to feel the specific exhaustion of a week spent in the company of something true and terrible and necessary. The scarf for Raymond was almost finished. She needed perhaps 2 more evenings. Outside, the February village was settling into its Friday night, its lights coming on in its windows, its routines resuming, its ordinary life continuing in the way it always did, patient and permanent and beneath the surface, full of everything it knew and had not yet said. She knitted, and thought about Edith Polworthy's hands laying pins flat for 40 years, and thought about Margaret Ashworth in Torquay, and the long complicated relief of being told the truth about a thing you have always half suspected, and thought about Gerald Clement, who was kind and who had done this and would now have to account for both, and she turned her knitting and began the final row. Chapter 9. What the Pins Knew. Friends, we are nearly home. 1 chapter after this, and the story of Edith Polworthy and the dressmaker's pin will be complete. But before we arrive at the ending, we must spend a little time in the place that every good mystery earns its way into, which is not the courtroom or the police station, but the quieter room where the people most affected by a thing sit with what has happened and try to understand what it means for the life that remains. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. When a person you trusted is revealed to have done something that cannot be reconciled with the person you knew, which do you grieve more, the harm they caused, or the version of them you have to give up? Tell us in the comments. It is not a comfortable question, but it is the question Saint Mary Mead was sitting with on a grey Saturday morning in February, and it is the question Miss Marple had been sitting with since Friday afternoon. She did not sleep well. This was not unusual at the end of a case. People who imagined that the resolution of such things brought immediate rest did not understand the particular quality of mind that had spent a week moving through a problem at depth, turning it, examining it from multiple angles, pressing on its weak points. Such a mind did not simply stop because the problem was solved. It continued for a time, running over what it had done and whether it had done it rightly, and Miss Marple's did so until somewhere past 2 in the morning, when she finally set it aside with the deliberate firmness she applied to things that were finished and needed to be recognised as finished. She was up at 7, she made her tea. She stood at her kitchen window and looked at the February garden, where nothing was happening above ground and a great deal was happening below it, the slow patient work of roots in cold soil, the unremarked persistence of things that had decided to continue. She was thinking about Clara. Clara Burse had lost her employer, her daily work, the particular education of watching a skilled woman practice a craft for 2 years, and the uncomplicated safety of a working life that asked comprehensible things of her. She was 19, and she had found a dead woman, and she had been right about the pin, and no one official had listened. And now someone was going to prison, and Edith Polworthy was still dead, and the cottage on Vicarage Lane would be emptied and sold, and Clara would have to find another position. Miss Marple thought this required attention before anything else. She put on her coat at 9:30 and walked to the Burse house, and she arrived to find Clara in the kitchen helping her mother make bread, which was, she thought, a very good sign. The return to the making of ordinary things was the body's own intelligence about recovery, and one ought not to interrupt it, but one could sit at the kitchen table and drink the tea that was offered and be simply present. She sat. She drank her tea. She watched Clara's hands working the dough with the steady, capable rhythm of someone who knows what they're doing, and she thought about how those same hands had noticed a pin and a chair and a thimble on a Wednesday morning, and had known, without being able to say why, that something was wrong. "I want to talk to you about what comes next," she said, when the bread was shaped and covered and set to prove beside the range. "Not today. Perhaps on Monday, when things are a little quieter, but I want you to know that I have been thinking about it." Clara looked at her across the table. She had slept better than Miss Marple. You could see it in her face, the particular quality of a young person whose body insists on rest regardless of what the mind would prefer. "About work, do you mean?" she said. "About work," said Miss Marple, "and about the skill you have been developing, which is not nothing and should not be lost. Edith trained you carefully, and that training is yours, and it belongs to the next chapter of your life rather than to the one that has just closed." She paused. "There is a woman in Radchester who runs a proper dressmaking establishment, a Mrs. Fellows, who takes apprentices and trains them properly, and whose work is very well regarded in the county. I'm going to write to her this week. I'm not promising anything, but I think she'll be interested, and I think you should be prepared to go and speak to her if she is." Clara was quiet for a moment. Her mother at the range was making herself very busy with the kettle, in the way that mothers do when their children are receiving something significant and they want neither to interrupt nor to miss it. "Why would you do that?" said Clara, not with suspicion, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who has not yet accumulated enough experience to take kindness for granted. "Because you were right about the pin," said Miss Marple. "And because being right about a thing you cannot prove, and carrying it quietly while you wait for someone to help you prove it, requires a particular quality of mind that should not be wasted folding sheets in a boarding house." She picked up her teacup. "Also, Edith would have done it herself, I think. She simply did not have time." Clara looked at the table. She pressed her lips together once, briefly, in the way of someone managing something they have decided not to cry about. "Yes," she said, "she would have." Miss Marple finished her tea. She said goodbye to Mrs. Burse, who pressed another cup on her that she accepted and drank, standing at the kitchen door because she had a number of other calls to make this morning and would not be sitting down again for some time. She went next to Miss Hartnell. Miss Hartnell had received, that morning, a reply by telegram from Torquay. She showed it to Miss Marple across the same small warm room where they had sat 2 days previously, and Miss Marple read it. Margaret Ashworth had written 3 sentences. She wrote that she had received Miss Hartnell's letter and understood its meaning. She wrote that she would be grateful to be told, when it was appropriate, whatever could properly be told. And she wrote, in the 3rd sentence, which was shorter than the others, and which carried the weight of 8 years in 9 words, that she had always believed this day would come. Miss Marple folded the telegram along its original crease and handed it back. "She will need someone to speak to her properly," she said. "Not a letter, a visit. Someone who can explain what has been discovered and how, and what will happen now, and answer the questions she will have that cannot be answered in writing." She looked at Miss Hartnell. "I think that should be you. You know the county. You know how to manage official information without making it feel official, and she will want to speak to someone who knew Edith." "I never knew Edith well," said Miss Hartnell. "No," said Miss Marple. "But you know what Edith did, and you can tell Margaret Ashworth that there was a woman in this village who carried her family's story for 8 years and did not allow it to die with her, and I think that is what Margaret Ashworth most needs to hear. The fact of someone caring enough to hold a thing in trust until it could be put right." Miss Hartnell looked at the telegram. She looked at the fire. She looked at Miss Marple with the expression she wore when she was arriving at a decision she had already made, and was simply completing the formality of acknowledging it. "I'll go on Tuesday," she said. "I'll write today and telephone in the morning." "Good," said Miss Marple. She went home by way of Vicarage Lane because there was one more call she intended to make before the morning was over, and the cottage on Vicarage Lane was where it needed to be made. Philip Polworthy was still there. She had thought he might be because the solicitor would need several days to begin the process of establishing the estate, and Philip was the sort of man who, having arrived somewhere with official permission to be there, would remain until official permission ceased. He answered the door with slightly less wariness than on her previous visit, possibly because she had brought nothing edible this time, and therefore appeared to want nothing from him beyond conversation. She told him, plainly, that the police had made an arrest in connection with his aunt's death, that it had been established she was murdered, and that the motive related to something she had known and intended to act upon, and that it had nothing to do with Philip, or with the estate, or with anything that touched him personally. She told him this because she'd seen the anxiety in his face on Thursday morning, the anxiety of a man who has found himself unexpectedly proximate to a situation he does not understand, and she thought the anxiety deserved to be addressed directly, rather than left to resolve itself slowly through official channels. He received the information with the expression of a man to whom several things are simultaneously becoming clear. "The envelope," he said. "The one that wasn't there when I arrived." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I'd found it," he said slowly. "Or rather, I'd found evidence of it. She'd been pressing quite hard when she wrote. You could see the indentation on the blotter beneath. I could make out part of a name. Ashworth, I thought, or something like it. I didn't know what to make of it." "You were not wrong," said Miss Marple. He was quiet for a moment, standing in the doorway of his aunt's cottage with the cold February air coming in past him, looking at Miss Marple with the slightly dazed expression of someone assembling a picture from pieces they did not know were related. "She was a remarkable woman," he said. "I didn't know her as well as I should have." "No," said Miss Marple, not unkindly, "but that is fairly common with remarkable people who are also private ones. They make themselves easy to overlook, and the people who love them sometimes accept that invitation without realizing they have done so." She paused. "She thought well of you, I believe. Clara mentioned it. She said your aunt spoke of you as someone who would find his way to the right thing given time." This appeared to cost him something to hear. "I'd like to do something," he said, "for the Ashworths, if there's something appropriate. I don't know what that would be." "I don't know either," said Miss Marple honestly, "but I think Margaret Ashworth will have views on the subject when she's ready to have them. Miss Hartnell will be going to see her on Tuesday. You might write to her through Miss Hartnell if you like, to introduce yourself and express the wish. Not the means, not yet. Just the wish." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "I'll do that." She walked home from Vicarage Lane for the second time that morning, past the churchyard wall, past the boot scraper on the side gate where the thread had been, past the bare honeysuckle on the cottage front wall, trained along its wire with the patience of someone who knew that certain beautiful things required years before they declared themselves. The lane was quiet. The village was quiet. Saturday mornings in February had a particular quality of suspension. The week done, and the next not yet begun. The cold holding everything in its careful stillness. She thought about all the people she had spoken to in the past week, and what each of them would carry forward from it. Clara, going to Radchester and a proper training, and the knowledge that she had been right about the pin and it had mattered. Miss Hartnell going to Torquay on Tuesday with the news that Edith had not let the truth die with her. Philip Polworthy, standing in his aunt's doorway understanding for the first time who she had been. Margaret Ashworth, in a small house in Torquay, reading a telegram that told her someone had cared enough to look. And Gerald Clement, who had been kind and who had done this, sitting wherever he was sitting on a grey Saturday morning, no longer managing the weight he had carried for 8 years, but carrying a different and heavier one, the weight of having been seen for what he had done, which is always, she had found, heavier than the weight of the doing. She let herself through her garden gate. The February garden was exactly as she had left it, patient and bare and quietly persisting. She went inside and put the kettle on and sat down and picked up the scarf for Raymond and finished the last 6 rows in the good steady silence of a winter morning, and when she cast off the final stitch she held the scarf in her lap for a moment and looked at it. Dark blue wool, long enough and warm enough, made for a man who never wore scarves but who might, she had always thought, one day find himself glad to have one. She folded it carefully and set it aside and began to think about what she would have for lunch, and whether the garden she'd needed attention before the next frost, and whether Mrs. Bantry had mentioned something about a new lending library acquisition that she'd been meaning to follow up on, and all the small ordinary questions that fill a life when the large and necessary thing has been done, and it is time, once again, to live in the world as it usually is. Outside, a blackbird tried its phrase again, more confidently this time, the small exploratory song of something deciding that February, despite its considerable evidence to the contrary, might after all be approaching its end. Miss Marple listened and found that she agreed. Chapter 10. The Village. In February. Friends, we have arrived. This is the last chapter of our story, and before we begin it, I want to ask you one final question. The question I've been saving since chapter 1. Do you believe that a village, or a street, or a community of any kind is changed by the things that happen within it, even when those things are never spoken of openly? Tell us in the comments. Because St. Mary Mead is about to answer that question in its own quiet, unhurried way. The trial of the Reverend Gerald Clement took place in the county assizes at Radchester in the second week of April, 8 weeks after Edith Polworthy's death. Miss Marple did not attend. She had given her evidence in a formal statement, as Dr. Warren had given his, and as Clara Burse had given hers, and the statements were read into the record with the careful impersonality of a legal process, which turned the particular and the human into the precise and the procedural, as legal process always does. Inspector Slack attended all 3 days. Dr. Haydock attended the first. Miss Hartnell, who was not required as a witness, but who felt that someone from St. Mary Mead ought to be present for reasons she described as a matter of decency, attended all 3 days as well, and reported back each evening to Miss Marple by telephone with the focused efficiency of a woman who has decided that this is her responsibility and intends to discharge it properly. The jury took 4 hours. Gerald Clement was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. The jury, having accepted the argument advanced by his counsel that the second visit to Edith Polworthy's cottage had been made without premeditated intent to kill, that what had happened at the workbench had been the act of a man in extremis rather than a man with a plan, and that this distinction, while not exculpatory, was material to the nature of the offence. He was sentenced to 7 years. He would serve, in all probability, rather less than that. He was 61 years old, and he was not a wicked man. He was a man who had done something wicked, and the distance between those two descriptions was, in Miss Marple's experience, both very small and very large, depending on where you were standing when you measured it. Miss Hartnell relayed this verdict at 6:30 on the third evening, and Miss Marple thanked her and set down the telephone and sat for a moment in the particular quiet that follows the conclusion of something that has occupied a great deal of one's attention for an extended period. Then she went to the kitchen and made herself a boiled egg and 2 slices of toast, and sat at the kitchen table and ate them in the comfortable silence of a woman who is, for the moment, thinking about nothing in particular, and finding that quite sufficient. Outside, the April evening was coming in gently, the days having lengthened considerably since February, the light holding past 7 now in the way that always surprised her slightly, as though each spring were a small, renewable act of faith that she had not quite expected to be redeemed. She thought about Clara. Clara had gone to Radchester in March for her interview with Mrs. Fellows, the dressmaker whom Miss Marple had written to in the second week of the investigation, and who had replied within 4 days with the brisk, interested tone of a professional woman who recognises a useful recommendation when she receives one. The interview had gone well, Clara had reported, with the understatement of someone who has been told something very good and is not yet sure she entirely believes it. Mrs. Fellows had offered her a position beginning in May, a proper apprenticeship with a proper wage and the prospect in time of genuine advancement. Clara had accepted on the spot, which was, Miss Marple thought, exactly right. She thought about Margaret Ashworth. Miss Hartnell had gone to Torquay on a Tuesday in March, as she had said she would, and had spent 2 days there, which was longer than the single afternoon she had originally planned, because Margaret Ashworth had, it turned out, a great deal to say once the saying of it became possible, and Miss Hartnell, who was blunt and good-hearted, and who had over a long life learned to listen as well as she talked, which was no small achievement, had sat with her through all of it. She had come back to St. Mary Mead with the look of a woman who has been given something difficult to carry and has decided to carry it gladly. And she had told Miss Marple over tea that Margaret Ashworth was not as diminished as she had feared, that 8 years of reduced circumstances had not broken her, but had made her in certain ways that were hard to articulate and easy to feel in the room with her, rather more herself than she had perhaps been before. Her daughter Frances had been there too, quiet and watchful in the manner of a young woman who has grown up understanding that the world requires careful navigation, and who has developed the skill for it without losing the warmth beneath. Margaret Ashworth had sent a letter to Philip Polworthy. Miss Hartnell had brought it back to him herself, which was perhaps unconventional, but was, Miss Marple thought, the right thing to do. The letter was not long. It said, in the careful, measured language of someone who has thought a great deal about what they want to say and has stripped it to its essentials, that she was grateful to know what Edith had tried to do, and that she was glad someone had listened, and that she did not know what form any further connection between herself and the Polworthy estate might take, but that she was willing in time to find out. Philip Polworthy had read it in the doorway of his aunt's cottage, which he had not yet been able to bring himself to begin clearing, and had folded it with the care of someone handling a document of some importance, which it was, and had put it in his coat pocket, and had said to Miss Hartnell and to no one in particular that he thought his aunt would have considered this a satisfactory outcome, all things considered. Miss Hartnell had agreed. Miss Marple finished her egg and her toast and washed her plate and put it away and went back to the sitting-room, where the April light was going softly from the window and her knitting was in the basket beside her chair, and the garden was visible through the glass, its winter bareness entirely gone now, the roses coming on, the first of the sweet peas beginning to find their way up the south wall, in the tentative exploratory way of something that has been promised warmth, and is cautiously beginning to believe it. She sat down and picked up her knitting, which was a new project now, a pair of socks in dark green wool for no one in particular, begun because she had finished Raymond's scarf and the scarf for Raymond's friend, and the cardigan for her great niece, and her hands required something to do while her mind was occupied, and her mind was, this evening, occupied in a particular way that she had come to recognise over many years. She was thinking about Edith Polworthy. Not about the case, not about the pins or the thimble or the thread on the boot scraper, or any of the careful chain of evidence that had led from that first cold morning in February to a courtroom in Radchester in April. She was thinking about Edith herself, about a woman who had sat at a workbench below a south-facing window for 30 years, and heard the village confide its secrets into the air above its own collarbones, and had held all of it, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, the way a clear pool holds the reflection of everything above it without disturbing any of it. And then, at the end, had decided that holding was not enough. There was something in that worth sitting with. Not a lesson exactly. Miss Marple was not a woman who believed that the things life taught you sorted themselves neatly into lessons. She was a woman who believed that the things life taught you stayed with you, accumulated, altered the quality of your attention over time, made you, if you were paying the right kind of attention, slightly better at seeing the world as it was rather than as you wished it to be. And that was worth something, not everything, but something, and something was usually enough. Outside, the blackbird that had been trying its phrase since February was now entirely confident of it, and offered it to the April evening with the authority of a musician who has practised a thing until it is not practised at all but simply true, and the evening received it, and the village received it, patient and permanent and full, as it always was, there of everything it knew. Miss Marple listened. She was still knitting when the light finally failed, and she reached to switch on the lamp beside her chair, with the unhurried ease of a woman entirely at home in the space she inhabits, and settled back, and continued. The socks were coming along very well. She thought, not for the first time, that dark green had been exactly the right colour. Friends, that is the story of Edith Polworthy and the dressmaker's pin, and of Miss Marple, who noticed what a pin knows that a coroner does not. If this mystery found its way to you on a quiet evening, I hope it kept you good company. If you have not yet subscribed to The Fireside, the button is below, and our next story is already waiting for you. Until then, keep your eyes open and pay attention to the small things. They are almost always the ones that matter. The end.